In this video, we are going to take a closer look at one of the most infamous legends of the Viking Age, the Blood Eagle, often described as a brutal execution method where a victim's ribs were split open and lungs pulled out like wings. The Blood Eagle has gripped the imagination of writers, filmmakers, and fans of Viking history for generations. But was it ever real, or is it a myth rooted in poetic exaggeration and medieval misunderstanding? To answer that, we need to go far beyond the legend itself. This video will explore not just the story of the Blood Eagle, but the culture that gave rise to it, examining what Vikings actually did, what they believed, and how those beliefs shaped their approach to justice, violence, and storytelling. If you enjoy immersive journeys into authentic Viking history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. And feel free to share in the comments where and when you are watching. We always love hearing from viewers around the world. Now let us step back into the world of Viking Age Scandinavia, where violence had meaning and honor was often measured in blood. To understand how such a brutal image as the Blood Eagle could exist, even in legend, we must first understand the Viking mindset. The people of Scandinavia in the early Middle Ages lived in a world that was deeply shaped by belief in fate, reputation, and reciprocity. There was no central authority to enforce law across the land, no single ruler whose power could prevent cycles of revenge or personal justice. Instead, Viking society was built on kinship and honor, and both were maintained through balance. If one family caused injury or loss to another, the injured party was expected to respond. Sometimes this came through negotiated compensation, but often it came through violence. The spiritual framework of Viking life was inseparable from this sense of fate and obligation. The Vikings believed that a person's destiny was set at birth, and that death in battle or through violent means could carry a kind of grim honor. The world was not viewed as a place of guaranteed justice or reward. It was unpredictable, and it demanded resilience. From this perspective, suffering and death were not necessarily signs of failure. They could even be signs of strength if endured with courage. That belief was reinforced by heroic poetry in which figures often met their deaths in vivid, memorable ways. These tales were not quiet or sanitized. They were full of broken bodies, last stands, and vengeance fulfilled. Violence then was not just a tool for survival, it was a language. Through it, leaders asserted power, enemies were humbled, and the dead were remembered. That does not mean all Viking violence was random or bloodthirsty. On the contrary, it often followed rules that made sense within that society's moral code. Understanding this is essential because the Blood Eagle as a story only makes sense in a world where dramatic acts of revenge and sacrifice held real cultural weight. At the same time, it is important to be cautious. What people believed and what they did are not always the same. Myths can grow from truths, but they can also grow from exaggeration, misunderstanding, or deliberate invention. The image of the Viking as a blood-drenched raider is already a product of centuries of storytelling, and the story of the Blood Eagle, though it appears in old sources, is not what it first seems. Before we can test its reality, we must explore how justice actually worked in the Viking world and what punishments were truly used when balance had to be restored. Viking justice was not centralized in the absence of a unified state or nationwide system of law enforcement. Disputes were resolved through community assemblies and the weight of social obligation. When a crime or injury occurred, families were expected to seek resolution themselves, often by appealing to the wider community for support or recognition of their claim. The emphasis was not on punishment for its own sake, but on restoring balance between parties. This often took the form of compensation. If someone was killed, the offender or their family might be required to pay a sum to the victim's kin. This payment, which varied based on the status of the person harmed, was not seen as a fine in the modern sense, but as a necessary exchange to prevent further bloodshed. Refusing to pay or refusing to accept payment could lead to cycles of revenge that might span generations. Yet there were limits. Some crimes were considered so severe or so disruptive to the community that they placed the offender outside the protection of the law entirely. In such cases, a person could be declared an outlaw. This meant they could be killed without consequence, and no one was allowed to shelter or aid them. It was not a sentence of death in the formal sense, but it was often a death sentence in practice. Life as an outlaw was precarious, and few survived long once cast out. There are few accounts in historical sources of punishments that went beyond exclusion or financial compensation. In cases of treason, betrayal, or particularly heinous violence, some forms of execution were used, though they were not standardized. Drowning, hanging, and beheading are all attested in various parts of the Viking world. particularly in later periods when kings began to consolidate more power and impose harsher forms of state justice. However, none of these accounts describe anything like the blood eagle. It does not appear in law codes, in records of actual trials, or in archaeological evidence of punishment sites. Instead, the known methods of execution were pragmatic and immediate, designed to remove a threat, not to stage a spectacle. While brutal by modern standards, they fit within the practical realities of early medieval life. It is also worth noting that public punishment in Viking society did not primarily serve as a deterrent. The goal was to uphold honor and restore equilibrium. This could be done through compensation, vengeance, or exclusion. Ritual cruelty was not a necessary part of that system. If violence occurred, it was usually swift, not ceremonial. So where then does the story of the blood eagle come from? If Viking legal systems did not use such methods, and if their known executions were far simpler, why has this image survived for so long? The answer lies not in legal practice, but in the realm of poetry and saga, where history, memory, and myth often become entangled. The earliest references to the blood eagle do not come from legal records or eyewitness accounts, but from literature written centuries after the supposed event. The first known description appears in a medieval saga recounting the fate of a Northumbrian king named Ull, said to have been executed by Viking warriors in revenge for the killing of the legendary figure Ragnar. In this account, Uller is captured and his back is cut open, his ribs severed from the spine, and his lungs pulled out and spread like wings. But this account, dramatic as it is, comes from a period long after the events it claims to describe. The sagas were written down in Christian Iceland during the 13th century, well over 300 years after the Viking Age had begun. By then, oral stories had been shaped and reshaped across generations, influenced by changing values, religious beliefs, and political goals. Crucially, the blood eagle is not mentioned in early Scandinavian poetry from the Viking Age itself. It first appears clearly in saga literature and later poetic interpretations. In a few early skaldic verses composed by court poets, there are ambiguous phrases that some have interpreted as allusion to a gruesome form of execution. But these verses are dense, metaphorical, and open to wide interpretation. In Old Norse poetic style, Henning's compound metaphors were common. A phrase describing a raven's feast or an eagle's joy might simply refer to a bloody battlefield, not to a ritualistic killing. Over time, Christian scribes compiling and embellishing Viking stories may have taken these metaphorical images and reshaped them into literal events. It is not difficult to see how a poetic phrase about feeding the eagle could be transformed into a tale of a man's lungs being turned into wings. In a culture fascinated by martyrdom, sin, and divine punishment, such tales took on new symbolic weight. There is also the matter of political narrative. The story of Ella's death serves as a powerful reversal of fortune. Ella kills Ragnar, and Ragnar's sons avenge him in the most terrible way imaginable. This theme of vengeance and balance would have resonated with both pagan and Christian audiences, albeit for different reasons. For pagan listeners, it echoed the code of honor and blood repayment. For Christian scribes, it may have highlighted the savagery of heathen enemies, offering a moral contrast between the old world and the new. These sagas were not neutral histories. They were shaped by their authors' intentions, by the expectations of their audiences, and by the changing values of their time. The blood eagle may have been part of this storytelling process, a vivid, shocking invention built from poetic fragments, cultural memory, and evolving moral frameworks. In this world, killing was not inherently dishonorable. Quite the opposite. Killing was a recognized form of justice, vengeance, and glory, but only when performed by the right people in the right context with the right consequences. That framework was never designed to include women. A woman who killed, who fought, who gave orders, forced her entire society to reconsider what it feared most: disorder from within. This fear was not just emotional, it was structural. Viking men derived their status from military reputation and economic power, both of which were linked to their ability to protect and control. Their authority over households, over legal disputes, and over religious rights came from the assumption that they alone were capable of violent leadership. When a woman stepped into that role, and she issued commands, took revenge, or led a fleet, she was not just acting boldly. She was stripping that power from the men around her, and they knew it. The idea of a female warrior was not celebrated in Norse culture. It was feared, mocked, or buried in legend. The fact that such women existed at all, recorded not in fiction, but in historical accounts, reveals a tension that ran deep beneath the surface of Viking masculinity. These women did not fit, and yet they appeared ruling kingdoms, sailing westward, standing in courtrooms, sometimes covered in blood. Her very presence forced a reckoning, one that did not end in admiration, but in attempts to erase, ridicule, or mythologize them. To understand what Viking men truly feared, we do not need to look to the monsters of mythology or the armies of foreign empires. We need only to look at the cracks in their own foundation and at the women who stepped through them. In the early 10th century, the Viking world came face to face with a military leader they could not have expected. Her name was Thalad, daughter of Alfred the Great and ruler of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia. She emerged not from the Saras or from the fringes of Norse society, but from the heart of one of their strongest enemies. She was not a symbolic figure or a token of resistance. She was a command. While Viking armies had long invaded and raided Anglo-Saxon territory, Thalad turned the tide. After the death of her husband, she did not fade into the background. She assumed full control of Mercia. Sources from the period written by chroniclers familiar with the Viking threat make it clear that she was not only active in governance, but in military strategy. She directed the construction of fortified towns, planned coordinated campaigns with her brother Edward of Wessex, and led troops in recapturing key settlements from Danish control. The fortress of Derby fell to her forces, so did Leicester. She even secured an alliance with Norse leaders in York, a city under strong Viking influence. But what made her so disruptive to Viking dominance was not just her battlefield success. It was her existence as a woman who functioned within their own terms: leadership, conquest, and tactical power. The Vikings had encountered female queens before, but those women had ruled through marriage or bloodlines, rarely through military command. Bethfeld broke that mold. She was known as the Lady of the Means, not the wife of a king, and she died as ruler in her own right. The records of Alad's actions do not come from Norse sources. The Viking scribes who might have written of her chose not to, or those records have not survived. But their silence is telling. Her campaigns directly undermined Norse settlements and military control. Her authority challenged the narrative of male Viking superiority. She defeated them using their own strategy. And yet she was not mythologized in their tradition. She was not demonized nor deified. She was simply left out. That absence reveals something deeper. The fear Athelad provoked was not only in battle, it was in the memory of her, a woman who led armies, who reclaimed towns, who formed political alliances and defended her kingdom. This was not an enemy. The Vikings could easily fit into their worldview. So instead of praising her or condemning her, they ignored her. But her victories endured, and so did her legacy. For Viking men, her rise was not just a threat to their lands. It was a threat to their entire sense of masculine authority. In Halflod, they faced a reality they could neither defeat nor accept. A woman who proved that power, when used well, made gender irrelevant. In the 12th century, a Danish chronicler named Saxo Grammaticus recorded a tale that would unsettle his readers for generations. Among the warriors he described in his history of the Danes were women, real women, he insisted, who had taken up arms, sailed with men, and fought in open battle. Chief among them was a woman named Lega. Saxo did not present Lega as a noble heroine. He described her as wild, dangerous, and unnerving. According to his account, she fought with exceptional skill and courage, earning the respect of Ragnar, a legendary Norse warrior. Yet even in victory, she was framed as unnatural. Saxo claims she dressed like a man and possessed the spirit of a beast, qualities that made her more feared than admired. She later turned against Ragnar, killing her second husband to seize power for herself. Historians have long debated the truth behind Lega's story. Saxo's work blends myth, folklore, and political commentary. But the way he wrote about women like her matters more than whether she lived exactly as described. He claimed that entire bands of female fighters had joined wars against the Swedes, and that their presence on the battlefield was not celebrated, but cursed. He called them women who had lost their shame, who fought with ferocity because they had abandoned their natural place in the world. This framing was no accident. Saxo lived in a Christianized Europe where gender roles had become even more restrictive. But he was writing about a past remembered with pride by Scandinavian elites. In that heroic past, the idea of a woman wielding power, especially through violence, was a source of tension. Saxo chose to portray female warriors not as honored exceptions, but as cautionary figures. Dangerous, violent, and ultimately punished or erased. The association of such women with Ragnar himself, one of the most prominent figures in Viking storytelling, only sharpened the discomfort. If Ragnar, the image of Viking masculinity, could be saved or challenged by a woman like Lagatha, what did that say about the structure of male dominance? Saxo's effort to reframe her as a threat rather than a peer reveals the anxiety she represented. These warrior women, real or exaggerated, had names. They had motives. and they had reputations that outlasted the Viking Age. Their stories spread not because they were admired, but because they unsettled the world around them. Even when written centuries later, the fear they provoked remained fresh. Whether Lega stood on a real battlefield or not, her legacy reveals something undeniable. Viking society could imagine women with power, but only as something to be resisted, silenced, or twisted into myth. The deeper the fear, the more necessary the distortion. Among the settlers who crossed the North Atlantic in search of new beginnings, one name stands out with quiet force, or the deep-minded. Unlike the warrior queens in battlefield legends, Ord did not wield a sword in the sagas. Her power was expressed through leadership, wealth, and control, forms of authority that could be even more subversive than violence. Ord's story begins with death. Her husband, a powerful chieftain, was killed in Ireland. Her son followed him soon after. Most women in her position would have been left vulnerable, dispossessed, married off, or forgotten. But Ord did something extraordinary. She gathered her household, freed her enslaved workers, and had a ship built in secret. Then she sailed across the sea to Iceland, not as a passenger, but as a leader. In the early settlement of Iceland, recorded in historical texts like the Book of Settlements, Ord appears not as a figure of myth, but as a landholder and matriarch. She claimed territory for herself, distributed it among her followers, and founded a dynasty that lasted for generations. She held feasts, oversaw property rights, and shaped the landscape of a new society. What made so disruptive was not her violence, but her independence. She acted with legal authority, spiritual conviction, and economic control, all without the oversight of a husband, father, or son. In a world where women were expected to exist within the margins of male power, Ord lived at its center, and she did so without apology. Contemporary accounts present her with admiration, but also caution. She is remembered as wise, composed, and pious, but never gentle. Her story is shaped by a subtle tension, respect for her strength, coupled with unease about how she used it. She named her own land. She arranged her own burial. She carved out a space in history that had not been made for her. Ord never fought in a shield wall, but she represented something even more threatening to male dominance: autonomy. She showed that women could lead not by exception, but by design, that they could create, organize, and rule, and that they could do it better than many men. In Viking culture, where identity was forged in struggle, Ord forced a reckoning with another kind of power. Not the blade, but the decision, not the raid, but the foundation. And like the warrior women before her, she too was remembered precisely because she broke the rules while making others follow hers. As Viking ships reached the far edges of the Atlantic, new frontiers brought new dangers and new forms of defiance. Among the Norse who sailed west to North America, one figure stands out in the surviving accounts. Not for diplomacy or exploration, but for bloodshed. Her name was Fiercest. Fiercest appears in both the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, two medieval texts that recount the attempts by Norse settlers to establish a foothold in what they called Vinland. She was described as the daughter or half-sister of Eric the Red, and thus the sister of Leif Erikson, one of the most prominent explorers of the Norse world. But Fiercest did not follow in her brother's footsteps. Her legacy was not one of discovery, it was one of fear. According to the sagas, Fiercest joined an expedition to Vinland. When the settlement began to unravel through infighting, betrayal, and cultural tensions, Fiercest played a central and violent role. In one account, she lured rivals into a false alliance and ordered their execution. When her companions hesitated to kill the women, Fiercest took an axe and did it herself. In another version, she faced a native attack, seized a weapon while pregnant, and drove off attackers by beating her bare chest with a sword and screaming until they fled. Whether every detail of these stories is accurate is less important than how they were told. Fiercest was not framed as a noble leader or a misunderstood outcast. She was shown as terrifying, erratic, and capable of extraordinary violence. The texts do not praise her, they record her with discomfort, and that discomfort speaks volumes. What made Fiercest dangerous was not just her brutality, it was the fact that she stepped fully into a male role at the far edge of the known world, where order was already fragile. She issued commands, took lives, and justified her actions in the language of honor and vengeance. In doing so, she mirrored the behavior of male warriors, but without the cultural protections they enjoyed. Unlike Odd, Freyas did not build. She destroyed, and in Viking culture, that made her the embodiment of fear. A woman who killed without sanction, who disrupted not just settlements but expectations, who turned the tools of colonization inward. She could not be redeemed or ignored. She had to be remembered and condemned. Freydis became a symbol not only of power, but of its misuse. But what truly made her feared was the recognition that her violence was not unique. It was familiar. She acted like many Viking men had done before her. The difference was that she was not allowed to. In Viking society, threats were not always found on distant shores. Some of the most unsettling dangers came from within the household, the kin group, the very heart of the community. And among these internal threats, few were more feared than women who used silence, cunning, or subversion as weapons.